Streaming is started.
It's good to see all of you here. Many people have had the urge to leave or the necessity, and it's good to see this many that are left this afternoon. I appreciate all those kind remarks about us being here at Pearl Street. We're happy to be here, although one does not quite always know where one stands. As Ira Rice pointed out the other night, there is a sign out here that says reserved for Director Doug McClish, and there's one reserved for the Secretary, and he said, "Where's yours?" Well, maybe in another year, that might happen too. Maybe. Although the elders don't have one either, so. The scene is a Roman prison in which the Apostle Paul is being kept, awaiting certain death. He has fought a good fight, finished his course, kept the faith, 2 Timothy 4:7. He has also laid down his pen, having completed his final letter to young Timotheus, his son in the gospel. Unexpectedly, a visitor is announced. Paul does not know the man by sight who has come to see him, but he knows him by reputation. After initial greetings, the conversation begins. The visitor is one named Holaeus, and he says, "Brother Timotheus showed me your most recent correspondence to him, and I came to ask you to rescind a small part of what you wrote." To which Paul replies, "Take back something I wrote?" Holaeus says, "Yes, I know it is a strange request, but you know that what you write is considered by many to be practically law. You may have done great damage to two friends of mine, inadvertently, although I'll admit." Paul says, "But the things that I write are the commandments of the Lord." Holaeus says, "Well, of course they are, except for cultural statements, personal references, and matters that are subject to interpretation." Paul says, "Well then, how can you ask such a thing?" Holaeus responds, "Don't you think you were a little bit rough on Hymenaeus and Philetus?" Paul, "No, they're teaching that the resurrection is already past." Holaeus, "Well, I certainly don't agree with them either, but you weren't so hostile toward those in error when you wrote the letter to those in Corinth." Paul, "That was different. They were temporarily misled, and besides, they repented of that error." Holaeus, "Yes, but you weren't so severe with them. You have taken an almost sectarian stance. If you are going to start excluding people from the church just because we perceive some error in their thinking or practice, we, that is to say, even you, run the risk of being guilty of sectarian judgment." Paul, "Are you sure you're not a little lightheaded from your journey?" Holaeus continues, "Paul, when you determine loyalty to Christ on the basis of certain doctrinal tenets, you run the risk of developing a party spirit." Paul, "I think I also warned the Corinthians against that." Holaeus, "Oh, you did, and you stressed unity to the Ephesians quite eloquently. But what you wrote to Timotheus was of a divisive nature." Paul, "But Hymenaeus and Philetus are teaching false doctrine." Holaeus, "Well, sure, but you can't expect thinking people to agree on every detail of Christian doctrine. All we can hope for is that we might come to concur on the essentials." Paul, "You can't be serious, man. Don't you remember that I also cautioned the Corinthians to be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment?" Holaeus, "True, but you can't mean 100% conformity. We will never be able to achieve oneness if that is the case. And speaking of unity, when you wrote the 7 ones in Ephesians, you didn't say anything about conformity of views regarding the resurrection. Let's see, one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God. Those are the only things we need to be united on, right?" Paul, "Where did you ever get such an idea?" Holaeus, "Why, from Brother Rubelius, naturally." Paul, "What do you think faith is? The faith is the one body of Christian doctrine, and our hope is based on the resurrection of Christ. Holiness. That's just an implication. Doctrine is just not that important. You have to give up something to attain unity. Paul. Doesn't truth mean anything to you? People are believing a lie. Holiness. Yes, but it's good for there to be honest public disagreement. I really fear that you are developing a sectarian party spirit and that others will be influenced by you. Already, Hymenaeus and Philetus have had 3 speaking engagements canceled. Paul. Guard. Well, the major problem, as expressed by that fictitious conversation, revolves around a difference in emphasis upon unity and truth. Some exalt unity more highly than does God, in that they will sacrifice and downplay doctrine in order to achieve it. Others properly understand that genuine unity can only result from our acceptance of and continuance in truth. And we'll be looking as we proceed at passages like John 8:31 and 32, 17:17, 1 Corinthians 1:10, and Philippians 1:27, and others that you're familiar with. Many earnestly desire to keep as brethren those who have overly stressed unity, which is possible only if this group does not stray too far away from the practices they are willing to fellowship. Sooner or later, though, those who practice unity over truth or doctrine will eventually give up doctrine altogether. They go farther and farther away, and you can follow the history of those who have taken that approach to see that they have done exactly that. Just how far will the unity emphasizers go? How about meeting with those from the independent Christian churches? Yes, they'll go that far. How about meeting with others in an Easter or post-Easter celebration with denominations? How about fellowshipping those who are immersed, quote, to obey Jesus or to join a denomination? How about calling someone who professes to love Jesus a brother regardless of what else he believes or practices? How about accepting as brethren those who hold to premillennialism? How about counting as Christians those who remain in unauthorized denominations? By the time this out-of-control fellowship, as one has coined a phrase, runs out of fuel, there won't be anybody excluded from unity meetings in the entire galaxy. Jesus won't even need to be divine or born of a virgin. His mother might even be called another sexually questionable woman, with no satisfactory apology made for such blasphemy. Open division between brethren cannot help but occur. The only way to stop it would be for the overly educated, who appear to be spearheading the apostasy, to recognize the horrifying results of their approach and humbly turn back before it is too late. Unfortunately, pride is such a powerful motivation that it will probably prevent them from returning to sound exegesis and a commitment to truth. One of the more subtle voices in the unity camp is Monroe Holly, whose efforts in times past in spreading the gospel have done considerable amounts of good. They have been quite helpful. Those living in the Midwest, where I come from, though now I am in Texas, are probably familiar with his name. His tracts and Bible correspondence courses have been used frequently, and he continues to wield a great deal of influence among many. Although all of the good works he has done are greatly appreciated, he nevertheless must be challenged on what he has said and written in recent years. He has chosen to take up residence and be identified with the liberal New Left. This is a term, I think, coined by David Hester in his book, Among the Scholars, which I'd recommend. Most of the outlandish statements that were in the fictional dialogue that I set before you at the beginning were taken from statements he made in his book called Is Christ Divided? If you want to study the things in more detail or in greater context, then you might want to get a copy of that book and look at it. It is subtitled A Study in Sectarianism and was published by the Howard Publishing Company in 1992. No one can object to someone warning against the dangers of sectarianism. Certainly it has happened. It's been pointed out this week what some of the problems were in the first century, and how that the Sadducees and the Pharisees were sects, but also that the Pharisees were oftentimes very sectarian in their attitudes. And of course it is perfectly permissible to warn against that kind of attitude. And there is always a danger of God's people developing such an attitude. We do not have any problem with that. But, to paraphrase an old expression, methinks Brother Hawley doth protest too much against the concept of sectarianism. In fact, at the end of the first paragraph in his introduction, he concludes that, and this is a quote, "The greatest threat to the cause of Christ today is sectarianism." End of quote. No, it is not. Such a wrongful attitude is a threat, as are such things as materialism and apathy, as was just presented by the idea of not taking the gospel to all the world as we should, and not supporting those who are trying to take the gospel to all the world. Those are problems too. But the greatest threat to the church in any age is a lack of respect for the truth. That is the greatest threat always. When truth ceases to be important and highly regarded, people cannot be saved because there will be other plans of salvation offered that are not going to save people. People cannot worship correctly because wrong worship is going to be introduced. The ideas of men are going to be introduced, as they are and have been today, and people are going to do that instead of what the Bible authorizes, and thus be offering up vain worship. And so the plan of salvation is affected, worship is affected, the doctrine that is taught is going to be greatly affected, and people cannot even live uprightly, because the truth has already been compromised in many areas of morality. When we give up truth, all of these areas are affected. And so it is the greatest concern. We always want to have the attitude as, what does the book say? Not, can I win this argument, or can I make it fit what I wanted to say, but what is God actually saying to us that He wants us to understand, learn, abide by, and teach others? That's the question that is of greatest concern. Without the truth, we cannot be set free, John 8:31 and 32. We cannot be sanctified, John 17:17. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. Furthermore, we are at the mercy of Satan, the father of lies, John 8:44, and the sleight of men, Ephesians 4 and verse 15. We become ripe for being destroyed for lack of knowledge, Hosea 4:6. Brethren ought to rise up as one man and affirm fervently that we will bear the responsibilities that truth demands, including its defense, no matter what the cost. Proverbs 23:23, buy the truth and sell it not. We ought never to allow the Word of God, the truth, to be devalued or marked down to garage sale status. What is a sect? Hawley asks. That's the title of his first chapter. The material presented here is the foundation upon which most of the rest of the material in the book rests. Therefore, it is appropriate to ask if he draws the correct conclusions from the information that he presents in this chapter. And he spends the chapter defining the Greek word hairesis, or what we would call in the English, heresy. He defines it as a group or a party, characterized by various beliefs such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Paul was called a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. The word is used there in Acts 24:5. Christianity was regarded by some as a division or a party of the Jews. Acts chapter 28 and verse 22. Well, I don't think most people are going to strenuously object to his analysis of how the word is used in the book of Acts. He seems to be correct on that, as he is in a couple of other places where the word is found. For example, 1 Corinthians 11, 18, and 19. Where it is factions or divisions, or Galatians 5:20, as some translated, having a party spirit. But he seems to miss the boat when he gets to the last usage of the word in the New Testament, which is found in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. And if you want to read that in your Bible, the verse reads, "But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers."
Messages, 3 minutes ago, 326, 65, use 054448. For two-factor authentication on Facebook, stop streaming, button.
Bringing upon themselves swift destruction. Now, most all of us are familiar with this verse, probably. But here's what he says about it, and I'm quoting. "The issue is whether in this passage the rendering of hieresis as heresies rather than factions or sects is justified in light of the other New Testament uses. The position taken here," that means in his book, of course, "is that while there is a definite relationship between the false teachers and their destructive teachings, what is here called heresies pertains to factionalism caused by the false teacher rather than to the false teaching itself." He then cites a commentary by Raymond Kelsey in which Kelsey concludes the sectarianism brought into the church by these false teachers brought destruction in that it fostered licentiousness and created disregard for the truth. With all respect to both men, the context should determine the meaning of hieresis here, especially when the usage of the word is found to be a little bit different elsewhere. All agree that hieresis eventually evolved into referring to a false doctrine. Apparently it either always had that meaning or it had already evolved by the time that Peter wrote this verse, as a close examination of the verse will demonstrate. There will be false prophets, there will be false teachers. What did the false prophets in the Old Testament do? Create sectarian attitudes? Or did they preach a false, unauthorized message? When they spoke peace, for example, Jeremiah 6:14 and Ezekiel chapter 13:16, instead of the truth, which was that Babylon would conquer them, they gained followers. In fact, the majority of Israel followed them because the message was so pleasing. But it was a heresy. It was not the truth. No doubt they viewed, the people viewed Jeremiah and the other faithful prophets of God as sectarians. My, what a sectarian view you have, Jeremiah. But they were not being sectarian, they were speaking the truth, and the others were teaching the heresies. To gain one's own following, one must depart from the truth, since to remain in it would scarcely be distinctive. Christ today would be the leader and receive the glory rather than the one who wants his own following. Therefore, people speak perverse things to draw away disciples after themselves. Acts chapter 20 and verse 30. Their goal is not to create a faction, it is to have their own following. And wholly, I think, misses the mark on the purpose for these false teachers. To get that following, they must teach a false doctrine. A faction is the result of someone's pride and ambition, not the cause. So then, the desire for preeminence on the part of an individual is the problem. False doctrine is the means of gaining that following, and a faction is the result of his lust for power. Returning to 2 Peter 2:1, we must ask a question concerning Paul's interpretation of the verse. When the apostle writes that these false teachers, not factionalists, when these false teachers will bring in their destructive heresies, is he saying that they will bring in false doctrines, or a bunch of rowdies who will bring the party spirit in with them? Why to ask the question is to answer it. Everyone should be able to see that the false teachers were bringing in false doctrines, not sectarian attitudes. And this is the basis for much of what he has left to say in his book. He writes, the idea of false doctrine was not inherent in the Word in New Testament times. And so he has to try to get around the obvious force of 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. If hyresis refers to false doctrine, then the emphasis upon truth is upheld in the